Stuart Newberger is a senior partner at the international law firm Crowell Moring. He represented the families of 7 Americans killed when a bomb destroyed French Airlines UTA Flight 772 in September of 1989, killing all 170 on board. And he's written a book about his experience. Here it is, The Forgotten Flight, Terrorism, Diplomacy, and the Pursuit of Justice. And I should also mention that Mr. Newberger is a member of the Wilson Council. Stuart, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book. Quite an epic work. Covers
Thank you very much.
A huge period of time. Now, you don't write a book about every case that you're involved in as an attorney. Why did you write a book about this one?
Well, maybe the title is the best way to answer that. Right before Christmas 1988, Pan Am 103, a jumbo jet 747, took off from Heathrow in London on its way to JFK, New York. And a suitcase bomb blew up the plane into many pieces, killed several hundred people, both the crew and passengers, as well as the people on the ground in a little town in Scotland called Lockerbie. And the Lockerbie bombing, of course, was pretty much the definitive word for terrorism, international terrorism, until 9/11. And everybody knew about Lockerbie. It was unfortunately, very accessible, being in Scotland and in the UK. So many college kids from the New York metropolitan area were on the plane that this was basically on the front page and on the TV shows, literally for months and even years. 9.5 months after Pan Am 103 blew up from a suitcase bomb, another jumbo jet flying from North Africa to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris also blew up. But this one blew up 7 miles above the earth, above the Sahara Desert, a portion of the Sahara called the Tenere Desert, one of the most remote places in the world. No roads, 400 kilometers from the nearest village. And when it blew up, the only people that really were focused on it, of course, were the families of the French and African people on the plane, but also the French investigators, because it was a French airline, UTA 772, which is now owned by Air France, by the way. That investigation, which was run by the French, was really in the shadow of the Lockerbie Pan Am flight. And for many, many years, the UTA flight really just wasn't, if you will, on the radar of the world press and media, only Lockerbie. And as a result, the BBC much later characterized the UTA flight as the Forgotten Flight. And that's where I got the title.
In the book, you compare how iconic Lockerbie has become to 9/11, that it becomes a historical marker. Mm-hmm. And when we think of a certain category of type of event or type of terrorism, it defines it. So it just lived in the shadow of that iconic moment. You also refer to this as the greatest murder case in French history. What makes it so?
Well, it was certainly unique that the French were investigating a terrorist attack on a jumbo jet that killed 170 people in North Africa. But of course, the French have had a very long history in North and West Africa because of their colonial past. The flight had taken off from Brazzaville, Congo, French Congo, had stopped in N'Djamena, Chad, also a former French colony, to pick up some passengers, including the wife of the U.S. ambassador to Chad, Bonnie Pugh. Her husband was Ambassador Robert Pugh. And after the flight reached 35,000 feet, its cruising altitude, that's when the bomb went off. Because the plane blew up and crashed in one of the most remote places in the world, 400 kilometers from the nearest village, no grass, no trees or anything, the French couldn't even get there. There are no roads. So they had to send in paratroopers to get to the site, where they, of course, found the wreckage scattered over 40 square miles, and 170 people had perished. The investigating magistrate, that's what they call the detectives in France, who was in charge of this, Jean-Louis Bruguière, was the leading terrorism investigator in France. And he was charged by French President Mitterrand at the time to find out who was responsible for this bombing. Because they found out within a few days, maybe a week, that there had been some plastic explosive on one of the shreds of a suitcase they had found. So they knew it was a bomb. It wasn't an aircraft or pilot error. And Judge Bruguière did an extraordinary thing. Even though this aircraft was scattered in 1 million pieces, literally over 40 square miles of a terribly remote area, he decided to reassemble as best as he could, with his help of hundreds of people, the baggage area of the plane. And when they did that, they had to go through the sand, literally with little nets, shoulder to shoulder, looking down, any pieces of what might possibly go in the baggage area.
The forensics aspect of this sounds like the quintessential needle in a haystack.
This was a needle in 1,000 haystacks.
Oh.
And as a result, they found a little burnt piece of circuit board that they couldn't figure out where it went. And it clearly had been near the bomb because it had the blast characteristics from a forensic standpoint of having been at or near the bomb. And so they went to McDonnell Douglas, now part of Boeing, out in Southern California, where the plane had been manufactured. It was a DC-10. And they said, we just can't figure out where this goes on your airplane. And they said, it's not from our airplane. And the French said, no, you don't get it. This wreckage, there's no roadside trash. There's no dumpsters. There is literally not a blade of grass for hundreds of miles. And the McDonnell Douglas people said, well, this came on the airplane from somebody else. And that's where the detective story really took off. So not only did they find this little piece of plastic, circuit board about the size of the top of my thumb in this terribly remote place, but they then traced it down over several years to a small manufacturer of circuit boards in Taiwan, because there were some little initials burnt off. There's a picture of it in my book, which I take from Judge Bruguière's file, the criminal investigation file. And as a result, they were able to trace where that circuit board went and eventually found a manufacturer of timers in Germany who had an invoice showing they had been sold to the intelligence services in Libya, in Tripoli, and they even had a signed invoice and receipt from a senior member of Libya's intelligence services. An extraordinary detective story and an extraordinary result that was the combination of human intelligence, old, as we say, shoe leather, and forensics. And it's really one of the greatest detective stories of history. And even I had never heard of it until I started working on this case about 15 years ago as the lawyer representing the owner of the plane, which was an American company, and the 7 American families who'd been killed on the plane.
So when you do become part of the case, and we now have the suspect, Muammar Gaddafi and Libya, a rogue nation, how is there accountability, or how do you find justice when you're dealing with that type of international player?
Well, as I relate in the book, I've been doing this kind of work for quite a while. And 21 years ago, back in 1996, the U.S. Congress and President Clinton enacted an amendment to a very technical, obscure law that only lawyers can love, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which basically added what's called the terrorism exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. What does that mean for lay people? It means if you're an American who was killed or injured or kidnapped by a terrorist state, that's a list maintained by the Secretary of State. If the country's not on that list, you can't sue them. But if they are on the list and they committed an act of terrorism that caused harm to you or your family member, you could sue that country in federal court in Washington, D.C., which of course I've done for Iran many times and for Libya and Sudan. But this case, of course, is about Libya.
Mm-hmm. So when this case happens, and it's Judge Kennedy, correct?
Judge Henry Kennedy, who's now retired, of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. That's correct.
The chapter where you describe reading the decision off a BlackBerry. It sounds like primitive technology at this day and age. It seems very personal for you that you, at this point, you really wanted to see these families achieve some sense of justice, some sense of closure. Describe that moment to us.
Well, as someone who's been doing this now for over 20 years, and my background was I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. representing the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, doing criminal and civil cases for the United States. So I'm not a stranger, if you will, to this area of the law or that courthouse. But over the last 20, 25 years, as I've built a practice at my firm, Crowell Moring, to represent victims of terrorism, there's a lot of ways that you can help the families and achieve justice. It's not just the size of a check. Certainly, in our legal system, compensation for damage, personal injury, death, is a part of what the law has recognized for centuries. Mm-hmm. We get this from the British and from international law, even religious law, the Old Testament, the New Testament, even in the Quran. Compensation to families is a part of justice. But we do more than that. We try and give them some psychological justice. We try to give them some closure. Because if you're the spouse or the mother or the child of someone who's been killed overseas in a remote place, whether it's the North African desert or Beirut, Lebanon, when an embassy is blown up, or Nairobi, Kenya, when an embassy is blown up, or one of the other very dangerous places in the world where, unfortunately, my clients are working and living, you're not there when it happens. You may hear about it on TV, you may read about it in the newspaper. And there's a loss, there's an emptiness that's very, very difficult to fill, even with a large check. Coming to a federal courtroom in Washington, facing a lawyer who represents a country like Libya, and Libya defended the case, having a federal judge make very detailed factual findings and legal conclusions, holding that country responsible and accountable for your loved one's death, for their murder, whether it was your husband, your child, your parent, whoever it was, brings some psychological and emotional closure to the families that you don't necessarily get when you write them a check. And I think that's one of the greatest values that Congress and President Clinton gave to families. This is a bipartisan law, by the way. Republicans and Democrats all supported it. And this area of the law has very much been a bipartisan area, which I think speaks well, because we're talking about protecting our people. It's not a partisan issue.
So, but what Justice Kennedy wrote ends up not being the complete final word on this. And as you described, this is operating at different levels. And one is the total geopolitical level, where nations are negotiating. Gaddafi's trying to join the world of nations in a more responsible way. Things are happening. Explain to us what happened and how it affected the ruling.
Well, certainly. After Judge Kennedy, not to be confused with Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court.
Right.
I'm sure he'd appreciate that promotion, but he was a trial judge in the federal court. After Judge Kennedy issued his very large judgment against Libya, and was almost $500 million in compensatory damages and almost $1 billion in prejudgment interest. So it was very, very large. And it was a contested case. Libya had defended the case and taken all kinds of appeals. In between the time that we got that judgment and Libya's law firm was trying to appeal the judgment, President George W. Bush and Colonel Gaddafi entered into a bilateral settlement agreement to resolve all the pending cases against Libya, including our judgment, which was the only case that had ever gone to trial against Libya. And it was the only case where Libya had been held accountable legally by a federal judge. That never happened in the Lockerbie case. It never happened with the LaBelle Disco case or any of the other approximately 12 cases against Libya at that time. President Bush made a decision, and he was supported by the Congress, again, bipartisan, through the Libya Claims Resolution Act, a unanimous statute that was passed in minutes by unanimous consent in the U.S. Senate, and the next day unanimously by the House of Representatives, that shut the door on all these cases against Libya in return for the president doing this bilateral settlement and the Libyan government paying the U.S. government $1.5 billion, with a B, dollars to settle all the Libya cases, including the remainder of the Lockerbie case, the LaBelle Disco case, our UTA case, and a number of other cases. With that law, with President Bush's actions, all cases against Libya were done, and no one could sue them again.
Is there, because you wrote a book about this, it forced you to recap it in your own mind and through documentation in ways that maybe other cases just become part of your history and aren't reviewed in that manner. As a result of that unique way of looking at it, what are some things that you learned in retrospect that maybe are instructive moving forward?
Certainly. Well, here we are at the Wilson Center, a scholarship center. I know that because I've been on the center for a dozen years and great supporter of the Wilson Center's mission, of course. I'll just put in a plug. The Wilson Press helped me peer review my book.
You thank Joe Brindley in the
I do, and also two peer reviewers, two experts in the field, terrorism and international relations, were brought in to peer review my book. And that also gave the Wilson Press a lot of comfort that I wasn't just making all this stuff up. And that was important because having a couple of professional peer reviews by respected academics with government experience only further solidified the bona fides of my telling this story. But remember, I'm not a scholar at the Wilson Center. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a law professor, although I have taught at many law schools. I'm an advocate, and I was an advocate here for the families and the owner of the plane. And I wrote this book as the advocate, trying my best to tell as even-handedly as possible the story from an advocate's perspective. I'll leave it to others to be the scholars on it. But let's just say that in writing the book, one of my reasons for writing the book, as I said at the beginning, was so that the public would know about this case, not just the technocrats and a few diplomats and lawyers and judges. It was very important to me that this story be told on a lot of levels. The French detective story, which has never been told publicly, certainly not in English. the story of how Gaddafi was trying to get back in good graces after blowing up jumbo jets and committing mass murder in the skies, involving three of the biggest airports in the world, Heathrow, JFK, and Charles de Gaulle, and many other things that he did, of course. How our government, both from the State Department and White House perspective, but also from Congress, and also from the British, and also from the French perspective, and also from the Libyan perspective, and also from the United Nations Security Council, how all of those pieces interacted in criminal investigations, criminal prosecutions, domestic law, international law, and all of the diplomatic machinations that were going on while I was pursuing this case. And so by telling this book, I hope to show the public that there's a lot of elements to this. It's not just a lawyer in court fighting the good fight. Yes, certainly that's a part of it. And I, towards the end of the book, give some excerpts from the trial that we had before Judge Kennedy, where some of my clients testified about the nature of the loss of their loved ones. Remember, no one's ever tried a case against a terrorist state where the terrorist state showed up and defended the case. This is the first and perhaps maybe the last time it happens. And so I wanted that story to be told, but I also wanted to tell the story of how justice can be achieved, but sometimes at great costs and not in full measure. But I do reflect in the case, to answer your question, that I think we did achieve some measure of justice for the families because we held Libya accountable in court, in federal court in Washington. We got the President of the United States and the U.S. Congress and the federal courts, all three branches of our government, to participate in that effort. And while certainly our judgment was taken away by President Bush and the Congress, they did provide that Gaddafi and Libya did pay a fair amount of money to our clients and all the other Libyan victims of Gaddafi's terrorism. You can read the book to see how that played out, for good or for bad. But I try to tell that story in as fair and objective way as possible.
Well, Stuart, it's an amazing story, and it's exceedingly well told. So thank you for joining us today and talking about the book, and best of luck moving forward.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to come here. And as always, I support the Wilson Center, having been a big contributor and on the council for many years.
We greatly appreciate that as well.
You bet.
Thanks.